There we go. All right. So we're starting out with growing. And here's kind of the outline for the growing portion of the class. So we're going to talk about ground production of herbs, so maybe an outdoor herb garden, container production, both indoor and out, and then we'll go over some specific herbs and specific things that you might want to know about them, some of the most popular ones, and then we'll kind of end it with pests and diseases before we move on to using and preserving herbs. So what is an herb? It's a super broad definition, actually. There are herbs that are trees, such as a bay leaf comes from a tree. There are shrubs, vines. Herbs can be perennials, annuals, even biennials. So it's kind of more about the usage versus an actual what the plant actually is. It could be many things. Herbs can be grown indoors. Herbs can be grown outdoors, in containers, in the ground. So they're super versatile. And they can be grown year round. So that's a huge reason why they are so popular, I think. So let's get into ground production of herbs, some outdoor ground production of an herb garden. And here's a picture of some beautiful chives. So if you're going to be planting a new herb garden outdoors somewhere in your landscape, the most important thing to consider is the light that the site gets. So you want to get outside kind of all throughout the day and see which spots in your yard are getting at least a minimum of 6 hours of full direct sunlight each day. That's what you're going to typically want for an outdoor herb garden. If you are going to get shade at some time in the day, afternoon would be best. That's when it's usually hottest outside during the summer and things like that. So that's when you're gonna want to have shade if you do need to have shade, which I mean 6 hours, so you will have shade at some point. So you want afternoon shade. So the best site exposure that you're gonna wanna look for is a west or a south facing exposure. Those are going to be the best ways to face that will give your garden the most sunlight. The next thing to consider is soil. So all herbs are going to want moist soil that can stay moist but is well draining. Herbs aren't going to like to sit in standing water. So they're going to want the soil to be able to drain well but stay moist. And that's pretty popular among most plants in general. That's kind of the soil they want. So when you find your site for your new herb garden and it has plenty of light and it's a perfect exposure, you might need to do some amending. You can get a soil test to see exactly what your soil needs. That's definitely the best way to go. And CSU Extension does provide soil test kits, so you can get a hold of, if you're in Colorado, CSU Extension. If you're somewhere else, your local extension office, if your state has one, hopefully. And let them know that this is what I'm trying to grow, herbs, and that they should be able to tell you what you need to add. If you don't really want to go through getting the soil test, it's never a bad idea to just amend with some plant-based compost, mix it down about 2 feet, and that should be pretty good to just add some organic matter and lighten up your soil. Ideally, we want to see a pH of about 6 to 6.5. Soil pH kind of is what it is usually. It's really hard to change. It takes many, many years to change soil pH. And I'll tell you, here in Colorado, we don't have 6 to 6.5 as a pH, and we can deal with it. But ideally, that would be the pH that a plant would want. Now, if you have perennial herbs that you're keeping season after season after season that come back, before the first frost in your area in the fall, you should mulch those perennials. That will help them kind of stabilize the temperature, stabilize the moisture in the soil, and get them ready to survive the winter. And this goes for any perennial plant, whether it be your trees, your lawn, your herbs, flowers. You should always be watering your perennials throughout the fall and winter. That is immensely helpful to their health and their ability to come back next spring. So definitely be fall and winter watering your perennials every so often, even through the cold season. So water, most herbs are from a Mediterranean region and they are going to prefer a warmer, drier location. Usually overwatering is the easiest way to kill an herb. It'll encourage disease and root rot, and that's definitely, if you're gonna overwater or underwater, underwater, because they definitely, a lot of herbs are sensitive to being very wet. When you buy a new plant, the plant tag should have watering information as to, is it a high water user or moderate or low? and if that's not available, then the extension office in your county should be able to help you with that. Diseases, like I said, are very common when it comes to irrigating. If you do have a disease on one of your herbs and then you're splashing water on the leaves, it splashes to another leaf and that could spread disease. So drip irrigation is definitely recommended. Not every situation allows for drip irrigation. Not every gardener wants to do drip irrigation, wants to put in the work to get it set up. So that's fine, but just try to water at the base of the plant and not on top of the leaves. That way you're just putting the water right where you need it on the soil and you're not splashing it on the leaves and encouraging disease to spread. You will need to prune herbs. Obviously, we're going to prune them to harvest them and to use them. But for their general plant health, we also need to prune. Usually early spring, is the best time to cut back last year's growth. It's good to leave it over the fall and winter. It's, habitat for local pollinators and things like that. So it's best to cut that back in early spring, especially on your woody perennial herbs that you might have. Any time of the year, if there's dead or damaged stems, you can prune them right when you see them. That's fine. About midsummer, if your herbs are getting kind of out of control and too large, you can cut those branches back by about 1/3 to 1/2. Of course, leave some leaves, leave some growth nodules so that they can continue to grow for the rest of the year. And then this is probably one of the biggest ones with herbs. If you're using an herb for its leaves, so let's say you're growing basil because you want to use the leaves in your cooking. When it blooms, pinch those blooms off, just like in this picture is showing, just with your thumb and your fingernail. Pinch them off because the plant is going to put a lot of energy into those blooms, and that takes flavor away from the leaves. So if we are not growing it for the blooms and we are growing it for the leaves, get those blooms off of there as soon as they appear. There's no need to have them. Now, as far as harvesting outdoor goes, morning is best when it's kind of cool. You want to wait till after the dew has dried and a day there's no rain, a drier day. So you want it to be cool and dry is the goal. If you have a perennial, you definitely don't want to take more than about 1/3 of it at one time. That way it can continue to grow. Annuals, you can leave them about 4 inches tall at the minimum so that they can allow you to keep harvesting them throughout the season. But if you have an herb garden, you're probably growing them to use in cooking and things like that. So you should be able to just go out and get a few sprigs of rosemary, a few leaves of basil, just whenever you need it. And that should keep it pretty well harvested and pruned if you're using it pretty often. So now let's switch gears and talk about container production of herbs. And, like I said, this can be indoor or this can be outdoor. You can have them outdoor during the growing season and move them in during the winter. There's lots of options here. So here's a little table to kind of show you some of the pros and cons of the different materials for your containers that you might be using. So plastic, you can buy a lot of cool looking plastic pots that are really decorative and cool looking. They're good because they're lightweight. So if you're going to be moving your plants in and out, that's a good option. And they hold water really well. But plastic isn't really permeable to air. And sometimes we forget that the roots, they need oxygen as well as water. So we want air movement in our pots. And sometimes plastic might kind of restrict that a little bit. So that could be a con. When it comes to clay has great air movement. It's kind of permeable to the air. They're very sturdy, so there's good support. But if it's a plant you're going to be moving back and forth, they're heavy, and you will need to water them more frequently since we do have air moving through the soil. Wood, again, good air movement. But whenever you have good air movement, you're going to have to water more often. And there is a potential for rot when it comes to wood if it gets too wet. So they might not be a very long-term container. Ceramic holds water really well. They can also be very cool looking and very decorative. Most of the time, if you get a ceramic pot, it's going to be glazed, and that glazing will restrict air movement. So that's kind of just the same as plastic. Okay. So light's important outside, light's important inside. So just like outside, when we want to find the west or south facing exposure, that's what we want inside as well. A west or south facing window is going to be best. If you can't really find that area in your house, or maybe you want it to just be on your kitchen island where you can use the herbs, then you can use supplemental lighting. You can see this kind of all-in-one picture of this little countertop herb garden. It has the lighting and the spot for the herbs. So that's really cool. You can buy a grow light anywhere these days. Garden centers, hardware stores, anywhere really. If you have just some 40-watt light bulbs laying around, you can use them. You'll have to leave them on for about 14 to 16 hours per day. But a couple of 40-watt bulbs will be enough to give your plants a little supplemental lighting if needed. If you do have your plants in a window, you're going to want to rotate them periodically, a quarter of a turn each time, in order for the light to reach all sides of the plant equally. You'll start seeing them kind of bend and turn toward the light if not. So if you want to keep them nice and upright, you'll want to turn them periodically. Okay, so the soil in your container. Usually when you buy a potting mix, it's going to be a soilless media. So if it's not soil, what is it, right? There's a list on the right of things that could be in a mix like that. It could be, you know, sand, clay, perlite, peat moss, different barks. There's a lot of different things that it could be. So that usually, you know, it's pretty lightweight, so it allows for good drainage and good air movement, but it holds water and nutrients pretty well. So that's a pretty good thing to pot your herbs in. There's also mixes that are soil-based. If you get a soil-based mix, you're going to want to look for one that says that it's sterilized or free of weed seeds. That way, you're not growing plants that you're not intending to grow, weeds. It's not best to just take soil from outside, especially here in Colorado. Our soil tends to be pretty heavy and clay-like, so it's a little too heavy and doesn't drain well enough for a container. And also, you know, could be weed seeds or leftover disease or something like that, so you don't want to contaminate your container with that. So we don't usually recommend to use soil from outside. Now, when you're planting, you can mix a controlled release fertilizer into your media, and then it'll kind of release nutrients slowly all the time. And then during the growing season, you'll want to fertilize about every week or two, just with a fertilizer you can mix into your watering can, and follow the instructions for indoor plants. Now, how often you water, it really depends. It depends on the material of your container. Like we already mentioned, you're going to have to water wood more often than you'd water plastic. It depends on the environment. Are they inside or outside? What's the temperature like where you're at? What's the humidity like where you're at? And then, of course, the actual plant. Is it a plant that can dry out a little bit, or does it need to be kept pretty moist all the time? So it really depends. Read your plant tag, kind of just watch your plant. Stick your finger down when it becomes dry for the top inch or so. That's usually a pretty general requirement that you should need to water. If you have different herbs that have similar water requirements, they can absolutely go in the same pot, but you won't want to pot something that's pretty drought tolerant with something that needs to stay moist. That's just, I mean, one of them is going to lose in that situation. Obviously, outdoors, you're going to have to water more frequently. Under the sun and the wind, they're going to dry out more quickly. And then indoors, definitely want to monitor for pests and diseases. You know, if your outdoor plant has some fungus gnats flying around, not really a big deal. But when they're in the house, that can definitely become a nuisance. And things like that are typically caused by overwatering. So don't overwater. If you start to see some kind of pest or disease forming, definitely I would cut back on the watering and see if that helps. So let's look at a few specific herbs, some of the popular herbs that people might like to grow. Chives. I feel like everybody likes chives. They're hardy perennials in the onion family, so they're going to be hardy in zones 3 through 9. So they have a pretty wide range in which they can survive. They have these pretty puffy purple flowers on top. Once they're done blooming and the flowers start to fade, you can cut back those flower stalks. I mean, you can cut them back right away, but a lot of people really enjoy those chive blooms. So, you know, once they're done and they start to fade, cut them back so the plant can focus on the leaves. Usually you might get them in bulbs, or if you already have a chive clump, you can divide it, and it's best to do it in the fall, you know, maybe a month or so before your first frost. And fall planted chives, you might see your first growth as early as March. You can harvest them pretty frequently, and it's best to for their growth. They grow good in the ground, they grow good in containers, indoors and outdoors, so they're pretty easy. They are susceptible to some different kind of funguses, powdery mildew, downy mildew, rust, and onion smut. If you carefully monitor the amount that you're watering and you don't water too much, that will decrease the chance of seeing stuff like that happening. Cilantro is awesome to grow, and you also get coriander out of the same plant. So it's a 2-for-1. The leaves are cilantro and the seeds are coriander. So usually best grown from seed. You could do it in the spring. You could do it a little bit earlier in the fall. Germination can be a little bit unpredictable though. So probably plant more seeds than you think you're gonna need. They'll probably need staked once the plants start to grow a little bit. And if you're growing it for coriander, once those seeds start to set. Cilantro leaves can be harvested when they're young and fresh and tender, starting with the outermost leaves. After flowering, if you don't pinch the blooms because you want coriander, you shouldn't harvest the leaves anymore because they're not going to taste good. As far as the coriander goes, you're going to want to harvest when half of the seeds are still green and the other half have ripened to a kind of yellow-gray color. That's when it's best to harvest. The others will ripen out of the plant. Some things to look for are listed here, some leaf spots and flower spots, powdery mildew, and then caterpillars if you have them outdoors, you will want to look out for. Dill is an annual, belongs to the carrot family. Dill is either going to need to be staked or have some shelter. It's not going to do great in the wind. It's a little too flimsy. Again, best to start it from seed. Dill doesn't transplant very well. If you do need to transplant it, just be very, very careful with the roots. There are some root rots that it is susceptible to, particularly if it's planted in a container. We will see some caterpillars like slugs and parsley worms, which is actually the larva of the tiger swallowtail butterfly, for your information. That can definitely feed on dill pretty heavily. Lavender is a very popular herb to grow, and one that we would actually use the blooms rather than the leaves. So it's a pretty woody plant, perennial shrub, part of the mint family actually. There's a few different kinds. English lavender is the most hardy, so if you live somewhere with very cold winters, that might be the variety to try. There's also French and Spanish lavenders, and then lavandin is a hybrid kind of lavender plant. It will produce sterile flowers, so you wouldn't be able to get any seed from it or anything, but it's been shown to actually bloom quite well. There have been studies here in Colorado that have shown that lavender planted in the fall actually survives much better than spring planted lavender. It establishes more quickly, it produces more flowers, and you'll just have an overall better plant from fall planted lavender. It's very drought tolerant. Probably the easiest way to kill lavender is to overwater it. But of course, when you first plant it, it is going to need a little bit of water to get established. And you know, that you will, if you have a perennial, you're growing it as a perennial and you want it to come back the next year, definitely winter water it, just like all of your other perennials. Not a lot of pests and diseases. Grasshoppers might forage on lavender, but not really, it's not one of their favorites, so it probably won't be fatal. And then, you know, just definitely, like I said, don't overwater it. It's pretty drought tolerant once it's established. Mint, perennial, hardy in zones 4 through 9, a very vigorous grower. It will take over your garden. So if you do want to plant this outdoors in the ground, You can plant it along a border that has a very deep edging, or plant it in a container that you then sink into the ground. That should kind of help to contain those very vigorous roots a little bit, or else you're just going to have mint everywhere. Hey, if you have somewhere where that's fine though, then that's great. Plant mint, you'll have plenty of it. Because it is such a vigorous grower, you are going to have to divide it a lot if it's in the ground, or repot it a lot if it's in a pot. You can harvest it fresh really anytime that you need it during the growing season. There are a couple diseases to be aware of, some rusts, some different fungal things. Not really a lot of solutions for those though. So if you see a disease with your mint, probably best to just remove it right away before it gets too far along and start over. Oregano is also in the mint family, again, hardy in zones 4 through 9. It'll definitely like full sun. This one isn't going to like to be soggy at all. So you definitely want a well-draining soil. And oregano will actually prefer a slightly more alkaline soil. So if that's the pH of soil that you have in your area, then oregano is a great herb to grow outdoors. Over watering, especially in the winter, can definitely lead to some root rot. So you don't want to water too much. If you are able to overwinter it in your area, you'll want to give it a little bit of water, maybe every few weeks. And then harvest the young leaves anytime that you need them for your recipes or whatever you're using it for. Parsley, a little more tender. It's only hardy in zones 5 through 9. It will take full sun. It can take a little bit of shade. It also will take around the neutral to slightly alkaline pH, soil pH. Moist, well-draining soil, just like all of them. When you do see the flowers, it will flower. Cut those back because you're probably growing it for the leaves. If you want the flowers, that's great. Leave them grow. Harvest it anytime you need it. I know here where I live in southern Colorado, I can't grow parsley outside because the caterpillars just love it so much and they just eat it in one day. So a lot of caterpillars will love your parsley. There are a few diseases as well, but I think the caterpillars are probably the bigger worry. Rosemary, full sun. Usually we're going to grow rosemary by transplants or cuttings and not too much by seed. You can definitely, it can be done, definitely. It's going to be another one that needs repotted or divided pretty frequently. Any overwatering is not good. We will see root rot. You will want to prune it. It's going to flower in the summertime. Prune it lightly after it flowers just for its overall health. And you don't really need to fertilize it until after flowering. Leaves and flower tops, harvest all spring and summer, really, as long as they're there and as long as you need them. Sage, even a little, perennial and hardy in zones 5 to 8. You can prune it in the spring after the flowers bloom, which is normally around late summer. You're going to want to fertilize it if it's an outdoor sage in the spring when it first starts to grow, and then maybe once more in the early to mid-summer time. It can do great in containers, but you should fertilize monthly in a container and definitely don't overwater it. There are some diseases that you can see here, mostly fungal things. Again, just don't overwater and it shouldn't be a problem. Basil is one of the biggest ones that we're going to need to pinch those flowers off so that we can just concentrate on the delicious leaves. You can do your first basil harvesting when the plant's about a foot tall and has about 6 leaves. Then you're pretty safe to start harvesting. Main harvesting is going to be in the summer. You'll want to pick the big, oldest leaves first, usually on the bottom. In a hot climate like we have here in southern Colorado, you can harvest basil all the time. And save them and preserve them, which Laura will talk to us about. And that's good. The more you harvest it, the more it'll grow. Few fungal diseases, again, caused by overwatering. Thyme is also in the mint family. A lot of these herbs are actually in the mint family. Hardy in zones 4 through 9. It does really well in containers, especially as an indoor plant. And it tends to kind of trail off and looks real nice in a container. So it's a pretty one and a functional one to have in an indoor herb garden. And, I guess we'll say it one more time. Don't overwater it because root rot. So let's go over just a few of the really, really common diseases and pests that you might see and some options that you have to deal with them. And I think if I haven't made it pretty obvious before now, it should be, and I'll say it one more time, is that most of it's just caused by overwatering, and you shouldn't get a lot of those fungal diseases if you just, or if you're just careful about that. So powdery mildew, you saw that I mentioned that a few times for some of the different plants that we had. It is a fungal disease. So it's caused by a fungus. You'll see spots or patches of white or gray on the leaves. So if you look at the photos on the right, you'll see some examples of what you might see when you have powdery mildew. And there's also something called downy mildew. That's more of a yellowy kind of patching that you'll get, whereas powdery mildew is usually going to be white or light gray. If it gets really bad, you might start to see tiny round structures on the stem. They start white and then they start to turn brown or black. That's like a pretty advanced stage powdery mildew, and probably maybe an indication that you should just start over with a new plant. This is actually pretty common, especially in indoor plants or when you have plants that are too crowded and you're splashing water on them a lot. That'll spread it all around, and that's when it can get really bad. If it's just a little bit, remove the infected parts, destroy them, and just try to prevent the spreading to the other parts. So the cultural control here would be not overwatering. Cultural means something that you can do in the plant care that isn't a chemical control that might help. So definitely watching the water. If you do see powdery mildew, either prune so you're not so overcrowded, or definitely cut back on water, just concentrate at the base. If you do need to use another product, you can try a neem oil or a sulfur product that you can get at a garden center. And you'll want to apply that about every 2 weeks until the disease starts to subside. Fusarium wilt was also a disease I mentioned a few times. It's again a fungal disease. Now with this, you'll start to see some wilting and yellowing between the veins. So the veins still staying kind of green, but the rest of the leaf starting to yellow. And just the same with powdery mildew. It's caused by overcrowding and overhead watering. So if you can just try not to do that, that's a good preventative measure. If it does get out of hand and you need to use a product, you can look for a fungicide that's labeled for Fusarium wilt. So check that label and make sure that it's actually labeled for this and for the plant that you're using it on. Caterpillars can be really devastating to an herb garden. Many herbs will be eaten by various caterpillars. The easiest thing to do, caterpillars are usually pretty large. You can just pick them off and move them. And one of my favorite caterpillar control methods is to plant some stuff that they can have. So when they're in your herb garden, pick them off and move them to the plants that you're fine with them eating. And they'll have really no need to move back to yours if they have plenty of things that you have planted for them. So that's the easiest way, the safest way. You can also cover your plants with insect barrier if you don't really need pollinators in the garden because you're just growing plants for their leaves. That's an option. If you want to treat with something, you can treat with a product that it's typically going to be called BT. It's a bacteria that will affect caterpillars, or spinosad. They're both organic, but please just make sure to read the label any product that you use, especially if you are going to be consuming these products. So the last insect I'd like to talk about is grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are pretty difficult to control. If you've had them in your garden, then you definitely are aware of that. The reason they're difficult to control is that some years they're very prolific. They have good years and bad years, and on the years where that's good for them, there's a ton of them. And they're so mobile. They can, hop and fly all over the place. So even if you're controlling them in your garden, they're coming from all over the rest of the town, and it's just really, really, really hard to control them. I will say it's easier to control them when they're young and small. So if you start to see those young, small grasshoppers showing up in your garden, maybe kind of try to formulate a plan of what you're going to do if it gets bad. And this is a chart that is available in our CSU Extension fact sheet for control of grasshoppers. So it gives, some different kinds of products that you can use. and some comments on them. So if you look at our fact sheet, then you can look at this and find that some of them are able to be used on edibles, so herbs that you would be eating. Some of them are not, so you really want to pay attention to that. Some of these are organic and biological baits that will lure them in. They'll eat the baits, and then they just basically won't be able to grow anymore, and it'll kill them that way. So that's not something you'd necessarily have to actually put on your plants. So if you really have a problem with grasshoppers, this does give you some ideas, and you can find this online just by, if you just Google CSU extension grasshoppers, this fact sheet will pop up, and it's a pretty good little table for you to look at if you are having problems with grasshoppers. So I'm going to stop my sharing. That is the portion on growing herbs. I think we would like to take a 5-minute break before we get into using and preserving, just in case anybody needs to grab a drink or use the restroom or whatever. So it's 11:38, so or 39 now. So we'll come back and have Laura beginning at about 11:44-ish, and I will be answering your questions in the chat in the meantime.
All right, hi everyone. So it's 11:44, so we'll go ahead and get started again. Like Sherie said, my name is Laura Griffin. I am the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County in Colorado. And today I am going to be talking about some options for preserving herbs, as well as some specific uses for herbs, and then finally some flavor pairing and cooking options for herbs. All right, so to get started, an herb versus a spice. So these are two kind of culinary products that get lumped together in a category together a lot of times. So just so that we have some definitions to go off of, herbs are going to be used fresh or dried, and the flavor itself is going to come from the leaf. So we're going to be picking the leaf off of the plant, and that's what's going to be providing that flavor for us. Typically, herbs are going to be having a little bit more of a mild flavor, and they grow really well in temperate regions. So here in Colorado, we have a lot of great options to grow a variety of herbs. Spices, on the other hand, the flavor is going to come from pretty much anything besides those leaves. So it can come from the seeds, the roots, the fruit, the flowers, and even the bark. So as we can see in this photo, that is actually a cinnamon tree, and cinnamon comes from the bark of those trees. And spices are going to typically have a little bit more of a stronger, more pungent flavor when compared to herbs, and they grow really well in tropical regions. So here in Colorado, we are not really going to be able to grow spices effectively, but those of you that might have a little bit higher humidity and temperatures certainly could be able to. All right, so some uses for herbs. So for us, herbs are going to fall into three main categories, and those are culinary, aromatic, and ornamental. So first we have culinary. These are going to be herbs that obviously have a great flavor to them that we want to use in cooking. So herbs such as basil, rosemary, thyme are some of our popular culinary herbs. We also have aromatic herbs. So these are going to be herbs that are used for their scent. So herbs that typically have a really nice scent to them. A lot of times these herbs, the oils will actually be extracted in order to provide scent to things such as soaps or laundry detergents, essential oils, things like that. And then finally, we have ornamental. So typically we think of ornamental herbs as herbs that maybe have brighter colored flowers or really pretty blooms, such as this lavender that we see in this photo. But truly, any herb can be ornamental. So if you like the way it looks in your garden, in your home, you don't have to harvest it, you don't have to cook with it, you don't have to use it for aromatic purposes. Any herb can be ornamental if that is what you like in your garden. These categories are really just kind of giving us a basis of where to start, but they're extremely flexible, they're extremely fluid, so some herbs might fall into one of these categories, some might fall into two, and some might fall into all three. And that can be a little bit of personal preference as well. So what one person might think is really a beautiful plant and could be used ornamentally, someone else might not think that so much. So again, just kind of giving us a basis of somewhere to get started with uses for herbs. All right, so some quick rules for harvesting when preserving. So these are going to be specifically important if we want to preserve our herbs for later use. These rules do not necessarily apply so strictly if we're just looking to use them fresh. Like Sherie said, you maybe go to the garden, pluck a few leaves of basil, go ahead and use that for cooking for dinner tonight or tomorrow. Not so much a big deal, but when we're preserving, that's always going to be a little bit hard on our product. So we want to make sure that we are preserving that highest quality fresh product to give us that highest quality preserved product. So you always want to harvest in the morning on a dry, sunny day after the dew has dried, and harvest, if not in the morning, at least by early afternoon, because transpiration occurs more heavily later in the day, and that's going to lower not only our aromatic quality as the moisture leaves, but also our overall flavor and quality. And then finally, we want to harvest the leaves just before the flowers bloom. So anytime we are preserving a food, we always want to err on the side of underripe. So we always want to make sure that we are kind of right at that peak before things start to ripen too far, because again, any type of preserving is going to be a little bit hard on our foods. So by starting a little bit underripe and really that peak quality, we can assure that we're going to have that best quality for preserved as well. So for flowers, that's going to be just before the blooms fully open. And then if you're gathering seeds, that's going to be kind of right as they change from a green to brownish gray color. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different options for preserving herbs. And the first of those is going to be freezing. So there's a couple different options for how you can freeze your herbs. And this is something a lot of times people don't necessarily think about freezing herbs. I think a lot of times they think of drying them more instinctually, but freezing herbs can be a great option. So the first option we have here is called tray freezing. And I'm just going to go through a few steps. These steps are going to be universal, so no matter if you're freezing them, drying them, no matter which different option you're using, we always want to start again with those freshest, healthiest leaves. So if they're looking a little past their prime, maybe have some insect or pest issues with them that you want to cut off, maybe just cut those off, use that fresh. Always starting with the freshest and healthiest leaves. And we always want to make sure that we rinse them off really well and pat them dry with paper towels. So those two steps, like I said, are going to be universal for any type of preservation. And then with the tray freezing, all you're going to do is spread the sprigs or individual leaves on a small tray, cookie sheet, anything that's freezer safe essentially, and you're going to pop it in the freezer. Herbs are going to freeze relatively quickly, so I would say within 4 to 6 hours you can go ahead and remove them and transfer them into an airtight container for long-term storage. And what this kind of flash freezing does is it makes them frozen individually as leaves. So when you go to use them, they're not going to be all stuck together in a huge bunch, and it makes it a lot easier to remove 1 or 2 leaves and go ahead and pop the rest of them back into the freezer. If you don't do the tray freezing initially, a lot of times they'll freeze into kind of a solid block, and you'll have to defrost the entire block, take out a couple leaves, and then freeze them all again, which over time that's going to decrease not only the texture, but the flavor and overall quality of those herbs. Or you're going to have to just, kind of take a knife and take a chunk off of that block of herbs, which is a little bit harder to measure, a little bit more dangerous. So it really doesn't take a lot of time to do this tray freezing, and it's going to make it a lot easier in the long run. All right, so our other option for freezing herbs is freezing in ice cube trays. And I think this is one of the best kept secrets. Super easy, super efficient, and there's a lot of really great things that you can do with this. So again, you're going to start with your rinsed and dried herbs, and all you're going to do is stuff about 2 to 3 individual leaves or a spoonful of chopped herbs in each ice cube tray. You're going to fill that tray about halfway with water, making sure that those leaves are as submerged as possible, and you're going to go ahead and place that in the freezer. Again, it doesn't take super long to freeze, and it doesn't have to be completely frozen solid. So probably 6 to 8 hours. Go ahead and take it out, fill the tray the rest of the way with water, and then go ahead and freeze solid. So leave it in there overnight, maybe a couple days. And then once those are frozen solid, you can again go ahead and remove them from the tray and transfer them to long-term storage. So long-term storage for freezer herbs can be anything that's going to be airtight and freezer safe. So Ziploc bags work really well. Tupperware, some mason jars are freezer safe as well. So there's some options for that. And there's a lot of things that you can do with these frozen herb cubes. You can get really creative depending on how organized you are, but the first option is just to use them as ice cubes. So if you are looking for an ice cube or an option to flavor your water or iced tea or lemonade, you can go ahead and just use these as ice cubes, and it infuses those drinks with this natural flavor. So if you want to use mint or basil, lavender, you can really use whatever you like. And this is also a really good way to create not only a flavored drink, but a healthy flavored drink. So it allows us to add something that we know is, wholesome and healthy, and we are not adding extra sugar to our drinks or something that maybe has a lot of artificial preservatives in it. So that's one option. You can also use them for recipes. So if you know that you have a really great crop of fresh basil during the summer, you can actually freeze these cubes while they're at their peak. And then over the course of the winter months, you can actually just pop them into a recipe for pasta sauce or soup or casserole, whatever you're using, and you don't have to measure it out. It's super easy. And again, like I said, depending on how organized you are, you can actually customize these to your recipes. So if you have a sauce that you know takes 1 teaspoon of basil, 1 teaspoon of thyme, and 1 teaspoon of parsley, you can actually put those all in a cube together. And then when you go to make that recipe, it's all measured out, it's all ready to go, and just toss it in, super easy. And then the final option is you can actually just defrost them and then strain it, and then it's like you have a fresh herb. So if you again have those fresh herbs ready to go in the summer, you want to preserve them and make a really fresh, tasty salsa in December when we don't have those fresh options. Again, you can just get out cilantro maybe if you froze that and go ahead and chop that up, ready to go. All right, so like I said, you want to freeze herbs in an airtight, moisture-proof container. And the flavor is going to keep best for about 6 to 8 months. So after about 6 to 8 months, it's not necessarily going to become a food safety issue, but the quality might start to decrease and that overall flavor might start to decrease as well. Freezing is actually going to retain the flavor better than other preservation methods. So if maximizing that flavor is really important to you, I would highly recommend freezing. Dehydrating herbs is going to concentrate the flavor initially better, but it's also going to dissipate over time faster. So if you're looking to really maximize that flavor, freezing is a great option. All right, so our other preservation method is going to be drying herbs. And again, we have several options for that. So first is going to be air drying. And this is going to work best with some of our sturdier herbs. So rosemary, sage, thyme, savory, parsley. Those are going to be the easiest to dry without using a dehydrator. And essentially all you're going to do is gather a small bundle of these leaves, and you can either tie them or use a rubber band to kind of gather them at the base. And then you're going to just hang them to air dry. So you do have to find a place in your home that you can kind of create a little miniature clothesline. And you want somewhere that's going to get, good sunlight, adequate airflow, but maybe is not in direct sunlight all day, every day, or somewhere that's going to get a very heavy breeze. So it can be a little bit tricky finding the right place for that. But essentially, once you have that set up, all you're going to do is wait. So I can tell you in Colorado, in southern Colorado here, our humidity level is almost never above 9 or 10% in the summer, so we're pretty dry, and this process still takes 10 days, 2 weeks. So it's not a super quick process, especially depending on the herb and the size of the bundle. So some of you that have a little bit higher humidity and moisture levels, it might take even longer, so be patient. All right, and then just like the freezer tray method, you can also do this with air drying. So this is going to work best for some of our leaves such as mint, sage, or bay leaf. And again, you're just going to spread those leaves out in a really even single layer on a tray or plate. And again, we're just going to leave it to air dry. So most likely this will probably be placed in your home. So again, you want to find a place that's out of the way, that's going to get adequate airflow, but maybe is not right underneath a fan or an air conditioning unit, because these are super lightweight and they are likely to blow away. And again, just go ahead and wait. So again, up to 2 weeks for drier areas, maybe longer for those of you with higher humidity. And And as far as air drying goes, we would not recommend the use of air dried herbs for culinary purposes. Because as you can see, these are going to be left out either outside or somewhere in your home, and they're going to be exposed to a wide variety of contaminants. So that can be dirt, dust, pet dander, possibly pests, a lot of sunlight, possibly weather. And so it's really just not possible to say that these are going to be totally safe and free of any sort of contamination for cooking purposes. So air drying works really well for aromatic purposes, you know, if you like dried sage in your home or other dried herbs, as well as ornamental purposes, if you like the look of a bundle of dried herbs or want to use it in your decor, that's totally fine. But if you are looking to dehydrate herbs for culinary purposes, we highly recommend the use of a dehydrator. A dehydrator is going to be the fastest and easiest way to dry high quality herbs because it's in an enclosed environment. So it's not going to be exposed to those contaminants that you would find if they were just sitting, you know, on your kitchen counter or maybe a cabinet. And you also have more control over the air circulation, the temperature. So everything's going to be dried really thoroughly, really evenly, and it's going to create, like I said, that kind of highest quality herb for cooking purposes. Now, there are a wide variety of dehydrators available on the market, and they range anywhere from about $25 going up to several $100s. So there's lots of different makes and brands and models, but essentially dehydrators fall into two main categories. And the difference between those two is the location of the motor and the fan and the direction that the air circulates. So our first category of dehydrators is shown in this picture here. So the motor and the fan are going to be located either at the base or at the top of our dehydrator, and the airflow is going to be moving vertically. So some of the advantages to this type of dehydrator, typically they're a little bit less expensive, and you can actually add or remove those plates to accommodate however much herbs or other foods that you may be needing to dehydrate. The disadvantage to this is that the airflow is circulating vertically, so the plates that are closest to the fan are going to be getting more air than those that maybe are a little bit further away. So you do have to rotate those occasionally to make sure that everything is drying as evenly as possible. The other type of dehydrator, the motor and the fan are located on one or the other side of the dehydrator, and the airflow is going to be horizontal. So the advantage to this is you don't have to rotate the trays. Everything is going to get dried extremely evenly at the same rate and same time, same airflow. Everything is very consistent. The disadvantages, those typically are going to be a little bit more expensive, and you have to choose the size when you purchase it. So you can't add additional racks later. So you kind of have to be prepared for what size you want when you purchase that. But as far as drying herbs go, if you are looking to purchase a dehydrator specifically for drying herbs, herbs have a very low moisture content. They're very easy to dehydrate. So I would say for those purposes, the very basic, most economic model will work just fine. If you're looking to get into dehydrating a lot of other products, such as fruits, maybe jerky, then you might want to look at, you know, something a little bit higher end. But for herbs, totally basic is fine. Each dehydrator is going to come with its own owner's manual, and each dehydrator has its own specific settings. It'll come with a recipe guide with recommendations for how to set your dehydrator for what you're looking to dehydrate. So there should be a section for herbs in each owner's manual telling you exactly the settings that you need. So we would recommend definitely following that specifically. But kind of as a general guideline, typically for herbs, our dehydrator is going to be set somewhere between about 95 and 115 degrees. If you are in an area with a little bit higher humidity, you might need to increase that up to 125. And dehydrating herbs is super fast. It's like 2 to 4 hours max, and they should be done. And the way to check to make sure that those herbs are dried completely is that the leaves themselves should crumble to the touch in your hand, and stems should break cleanly when bent. All right, and then finally we have microwave drying. So this is a really great option for those of you that might want to still dry herbs for culinary purposes, but maybe are not interested in investing in that dehydrator. This can be kind of a really great intermediate option. I will say it doesn't work great with all herbs. Usually some of the smaller leafed herbs like we see here, I think that's parsley on that picture, does work really well. And essentially all you're going to do is take a microwave safe plate and then put a paper towel over that. And just like the picture shows, we're going to put our herbs in a single layer and place another paper towel over that. And we're just going to pop that in our microwave for about 30 to 60 seconds. After those 30 to 60 seconds, we're going to remove the herbs and we're going to check to see if they're done. And I can tell you that they will not be done. So what we want to do is place another microwave safe plate over the top of that and flip them over. So remove the top plate and again, stick it in the microwave for that 30 to 60 seconds. And we're just going to repeat this process until we get to that point that we know they're dry. And again, that's when those leaves start to become super crumbly. And if they have stems, they're breaking cleanly when bent. For areas of Colorado where it is pretty dry, typically this takes about 5 to 7 minutes of actual microwave time. Some of you with some higher humidity levels, that might take a little bit longer. But we do want to make sure that we are only going in 30 to 60 second intervals. It's important that we take those herbs out, give them a chance to breathe, flip them over so that they are being dried evenly on both sides. If you just stick them in the microwave and just, press 7 minutes, go, you're actually going to cook them rather than dry them. So kind of that giving them that break in between is really important. All right, so some recommendations for storing dried herbs. Just like with the frozen herbs, we want to store them in an airtight container. So again, Tupperware works well, Ziploc bags, mason jars work really nicely for dried herbs. They make them look really nice in your pantry as well. We want to be sure that we are labeling and dating our containers. So especially with dried herbs, especially if they're crumbled, a lot of them start to look alike. And it can be kind of difficult to tell which is which. So just throwing a label on there and a date with when you preserved those herbs. Typically we say dried herbs are going to be best within a year. So again, that might not necessarily become a safety issue after a year, but the flavor and the overall quality is going to start to decrease. So you might want to just clean out your pantry once a year and be sure to start fresh. Herbs are going to retain the most flavor if you store them whole and then crush them when you are ready to use them rather than storing them crushed. Obviously, we want to discard any signs, any herbs that show signs of mold or maybe the smell is a little bit off. Typically, this is not a problem unless our herbs for some reason didn't get completely dry. And if there's moisture left in those leaves and we store them for long periods of time, that's when that mold can start to appear. We want to place our containers in a cool, dry place away from direct sunlight. And again, try to use them within a year. And then just a conversion for you guys, if you are using them to cook with, about 1 teaspoon of crumbled dried leaves can be substituted for a tablespoon of fresh. And again, that's because when we dry these herbs, the flavor is going to become more concentrated, so it doesn't take as much of the dried as it would of the fresh. Okay, now I'm just going to go through some of our most popular herbs and some of the recipes that we are most likely to find them in. So basil obviously is a very popular culinary herb. It's used fresh or dried, and it's going to be popular in all of our Italian dishes. So we're going to find it in their soups, salads, sauces, pastas, pizzas, all over the place. Some of our most popular basil dishes include pesto. So pesto sauce, the main ingredient is actually basil leaves. And I highly recommend that you try a basil sauce from scratch, because I can promise you the flavor is so much better than the jar that you buy at the store. Another basil recipe is the caprese salad. So this is a really simple salad using tomato slices, mozzarella cheese, basil leaves, and a balsamic. And basically it's just a really nice fresh salad for the summer. And again, very popular in most of our Italian dishes. All right, our next is dill. And kind of a fun fact about dill, most of our herbs really don't have a ton of nutritional value, but dill actually has relatively high levels of calcium. So just a fun fact there. Dill is obviously going to be very popular for flavoring our pickles, our dill pickles specifically, as well as pickled beets, some of our fermented foods such as sauerkraut. And dill is really popular in a variety of Mediterranean dishes. So just like we see basil with the Italian dishes, dill is very similar in Mediterranean dishes. So we'll find it in soups, salads, sauces. They use it to flavor a lot of their carbohydrate dishes, such as rice or quinoa, as well as their protein dishes, such as fish or poultry. All right, parsley. So parsley is kind of a 2-for-1. It is not only excellent for flavoring different dishes, but it's also one of the most popular garnishes. So if presentation is important to you when you're cooking, parsley is a really great option for that. And again, parsley does have a little bit of nutritional value to it. So it has relatively high amounts of vitamins A, C, and iron. And parsley pairs really well with meats and seafoods, specifically with a fresh squeeze of lemon. So if you really want to maximize that flavor, that fresh squeeze of lemon is really just kind of take that over the edge. All right, chives. So chives are very similar to an onion, and they have a little bit more of a subtle onion-like flavor. So really any recipe that uses onions, and maybe you want a little bit more subtle of that flavor, a little bit less of that flavor, you can substitute chives. Some of the recipes that we see most popularly with chives include soups. They're very popular on different potato dishes, so we see them a lot of times on baked potatoes or mashed potatoes, and they work really well in eggs as well. So again, if you don't want that full onion flavor in your omelet or scrambled eggs, chives can be a really nice option. All right, rosemary is going to be really popular for flavoring meats, so that's both red meats and poultry. Rosemary is actually one of our most aromatic and pungent herbs, so it has a very strong flavor, comes across as kind of a lemony pine flavor, and it's going to pair really well with thyme. So a lot of recipes you'll see the use of rosemary and thyme together, and a lot of times, again, that is going to be on our meat products, but rosemary also works really well in some of our Italian dishes, so you'll find it a lot of times in tomato sauce, pizza, and sometimes baked on top of fresh bread as well. All right, so sage is another one that's pretty aromatic, it's pretty pungent, it has a pretty strong flavor, and by itself, that flavor is not necessarily the greatest tasting. It actually comes across slightly bitter, but when mixed with the right ingredients, it makes a really great flavor. So sage is very popular in a lot of our stuffing recipes. So a lot of times you will definitely be using that sage in your Thanksgiving recipes for stuffing for your turkey or other poultry. It pairs really nicely with pork and fish as well. And sage is also one of the most popular flavorings for sausage. So if you ever make homemade sausage, sage is a really great option for that. All right, mint. Mint's kind of a fun one because there are so many different varieties. So not only do we have like traditional mint, but there's peppermint, spearmint, chocolate mint, even a strawberry mint or an apple mint. So you can get really creative with mint varieties. And overall, mint is not necessarily used for cooking a lot of the time, but just flavoring products. So a lot of times those oils are extracted, or they'll use the leaves themselves to flavor things such as gum, candy, soap, and liqueur. And then finally, we have cilantro. So cilantro is one of our most versatile herbs. And cilantro is one of those flavors that you really either like or you really don't like. So if you are someone who enjoys cilantro, you can add it to almost anything, honestly. It has a very distinct flavor. Like I said, some people love it, some people hate it. But it works really well in a lot of Mexican food dishes, salsa, soups, curries, salads. It adds certainly a distinct flavor to salads, and it pairs really nicely with both fish and chicken. All right, so that's all I have for you. Here's our contact information. Sherie and I are gonna take a minute to answer as many questions as we can once I am done with this. But if something comes up later and you have a question, feel free to shoot us an email. I also